So here we've got Jeremiah, and that was beautifully read for us, that piece by Lele, and I think he's a very interesting and important figure in the Old Testament. He was a prophet at a time when everything was going wrong and life felt pretty brutal. He was an extraordinary man for an extraordinary time. One theologian said not that long ago that without Jeremiah, religious history might have taken another course and Christianity might never have happened. It's a very bold statement indeed, and particularly because I think it's about a man of whom many of us may know very little. So I don't know how well versed you all are in your Jeremiah, but actually I think most people find him a bit of a mystery. So let's set the scene a bit. When Jeremiah began preaching, King Josiah was on the throne, and that was about 600 years before the birth of Jesus. And Jeremiah was trying to prepare the people for the terrible things that he could foresee were going to happen. And they just didn't want to know. In fact, they persecuted him for warning them that a disaster was on its way. I can think of many times in our own more recent history when that sort of thing has happened, and people are being persecuted for warning people about something awful. Jeremiah could see that people had gone astray and that the life they were leading would end in catastrophe. He kept telling them that they had abandoned God and that they must return to him before it was too late. And then, guess what? It was too late. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, first defeated the Egyptians in the north of Syria, and he had a massive army. And then he headed towards Jerusalem. And Jeremiah was watching what was happening. He was listening to the news. He was keeping his ears open. And he begged the people to take notice of what was coming their way. But they carried on partying and listening to people who kept telling them that the advance of the Babylonians wasn't a problem. No problem at all. We can ignore that. Now, can you imagine how Jeremiah felt as the Babylonian army advanced and he heard of their incredible and merciless brutality, and yet no one wanted to listen or prepare for what was to come? And when you look at some of the early paintings and carvings into rock of what happened then, the brutality was appalling, absolutely shocking. So when the great army reached Jerusalem, reality dawned on the people. And in an effort to save themselves from this awful thing that was about to happen, the city surrendered. And that did them no good at all, because there was a bloodbath. And most of those who survived were then force marched into exile in Babylon. Forced marches seem to be the way that many a dictator right up to the 20th century have behaved. I see there's a way to cow people. Now the conquerors, they didn't want the poor and the weak, so they just left them behind to fend for themselves. They took the food, they took everything there was, and they just left the poor and the weak behind. And Jeremiah stayed with them. Now, you might think that at this point, those people left might have turned to Jeremiah and to God for some support, but they didn't. Instead, they started trying to get Egypt to help them, which seemed remarkably silly given that the Egyptians had already been defeated by the Babylonians. But they decided to trust people who at least had an army rather than God who did not. And Jeremiah was preaching, "Blessed are those who trust in the Lord." And they didn't want to know. And that decision that they made was going to make things much worse, because the people had just not learned from their mistakes. And I think Jeremiah must have suffered agonies of doubt, but he remained steadfast. Listen to the words again from Jeremiah, which were echoed in our psalm today. "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It doesn't fear when the heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit." Now, if you're in a city that has been denuded of everything, if your family and friends have been forced marched away, you might think this could qualify as a year of drought, and that this will be a time to trust in God and plant like a tree in the water. But if we jump forward from the reading we had today, we can read Jeremiah's response to what actually happened. "Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Heal me, Lord, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are the one I praised." They keep saying to me, "Where is the word of the Lord? Let it now be fulfilled." Jeremiah is begging for the Lord to save the people. And what is remarkable is that God responds with such love and comfort. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I've banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile." So this is an amazing promise of God. And of course, what we know is all of that came true. And the people do return, and Jerusalem was restored. But the promises we read in this last slide are not just promises for those people then, they're ones of comfort for us. Because God has plans to give each of us hope and a future. The last 2 years have been terrifying. And when we were all shut away, it sometimes felt as if the pandemic would never end. That we would always be hearing the mounting daily death figures grow on the news. And that we didn't know when COVID would strike next. And yet, out of all of that, there have been positive notes. I now know more people on my street than ever before, because they knocked on my door and asked if I needed anything. And I was very touched by that. Thanks to Anne and Dave, we had a lifeline here at St Mary's with Zoom. And new people joined us for our regular worship and midweek meetings. And I think they saved our sanity, because we were able to talk and to see people. Our midweek Bible studies enabled people who could never have attended previously to be present. And on Wednesday, when we were talking we heard that for some people it was a real opportunity to share what was on their heart and their mind in a way they might never have done by sitting in church. But I think if we go back to Jeremiah, he must have often felt exhausted and defeated. And I imagine that Jesus felt the same in his ministry, with people constantly crowding around him, wanting to touch him, to absorb some of his power. And yet, even when he was at the end of his strength, he kept going because it mattered. Today, we heard in Luke an account of the Beatitudes, which is slightly different from the account in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus is surrounded by people who are hungry for many things. For some it would be for food, for others for healing, and for others it would be for some power in their own lives, because they were living under Roman rule and were deliberately kept poor and subservient. But interestingly, in Luke's Gospel, he goes on to talk about the woes, the things that are not so good. Woe to you who are well fed now, woe to you who are rich, woe to you who laugh now, woe to you who everyone speaks of. He's talking about actually being real, being realistic. Jesus announced God's care for the poor, for the hungry, for those who are suffering, and as we are on Racial Injustice Sunday, those who suffer the slurs of racism. And I'm going to add the slurs of sexism too, which are still there in our society. God will comfort and renew them, and he will renew the world. And I think this message of Jesus is intrinsically linked to the message of Jeremiah. And it can be summed up as, trust me, those who have lost everything and so must fall back on God are truly, truly blessed, as are those without power to change what is happening to them. And then they can only lean on God, and that makes them the fortunate ones. The lesson for them and for us is not to trust on good health, or money, or power, or government, or any of those earthly things, but for us to place our trust in God. Jeremiah said that God is as essential to life as is water. And to choose to live without water would be seriously stupid. And he's saying it's just as stupid to choose to live without God. He's quite blunt in what he's saying. We all need water for life. We all need God to live a full, rich life. And I particularly like this quote from Corrie Ten Boom. She was a Dutch Christian resistance fighter who helped Jewish families escape the Holocaust in the Second World War. And she must have spent her life being terrified that every noise outside the house would have meant the Nazis were coming in and they would have taken them away because they were hiding Jewish families in their home. She would have had more reason for fear than any of this. And that this quote seems to sum up today's readings rather well. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. I think those words are really worth memorizing. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God.